Hello everyone and welcome to another great SPREE seminar. Today we have the pleasure to host Nick Jones, Energy Manager for the University of New South Wales. Nick has been working in the sustainability and energy efficiency area for 35 so years. First in the UK in big companies like IBM, Johnson Controls. Nick came to Australia in 2007 also to start Johnson Controls here in the energy efficiency, then moved as principal consultant to energetics, and finally 2012 we had the luck to have Nick with us as energy manager. I've been very lucky to work with Nick for the past 5 years doing a lot of very interesting projects, but probably nothing compares in size and relevance to the PPA. The solar PPA deal that we finished last year, which is the topic of the talk. So, without further ado, please welcome Nick Jones.
Okay. Thank you, Jose. And good afternoon to you all. Good to see you come along today because this is about the university. The talk I'll give today really is just the backstory of how we started this process, the drivers behind it, how we actually then approached the market, the deal we struck, and some lessons we've learned from going through that process. It was very interesting from our point of view because we didn't have a template to follow in Australia. Some corporates have been working on a PPA deal for several years now and are having trouble closing them out. But we think with the team we assembled and the mechanisms we put in place, we think we've got a way to actually allow corporates to enter into PPAs and follow in our footsteps. So I think the first thing I just wanted to touch on was the fact of the number of players that we had to deal with. Normally when I buy energy, or bought energy in the past, it was a very straightforward process that we'd put a tender together, we'd go to the retailers, they'd give us a price, we'd do an analysis, and then we'd choose a winner and sign up with them. With the solar PPA, there were quite a few more players to take account of. Obviously we had to talk direct to a developer. This was new in my 20 odd years of buying electricity. I've not done a deal with direct with a generator prior to this. So that was quite a new field for me. As I say, normally I went to retailers. So we had to engage with the generators. Because the site was remote from the university, we also had to engage with a retailers responsible for delivering that energy to us. Also in the mix is the NEM, National Electricity Market. They set the price that generators are paid for delivering energy into the market. So they have a role in this as well. And finally, there's the government and the RET scheme. The RET scheme, in particular the carbon certificates that generated under the RET, the LGCs, they play a big part in this process. Probably about 18 months ago, Ian Jacobs was visiting one of our field stations, Fowler's Gap, in the far west. We've got a property there, if you're aware, that's the thick end of 40,000 hectares. It's enormous. And he was visiting the station because we'd been in occupation there for 50 years. So as a landmark, Ian and a team of the university executives went to visit to celebrate that fact. And much to our surprise in the facilities department, a video appeared of Ian at the station, and he was saying, and Fowler's Gap, wouldn't this be a fantastic place to build our solar farm? Well, as you can imagine, we we went into a bit of a panic at this point, and emails started flying around. Fortunately, we'd worked on a bit of a viability or feasibility exercise about a year before that, looking at the possibilities of building our own solar farm. So we were in a position to respond fairly quickly to Ian and his request that we work this up. And the upshot with Fowler's Gap was that although it was a fantastic place to build a solar farm, it was mainly cleared, it was in a good spot for solar irradiation. The fact was there was no grid connection. There was a very small cable carrying power into the site. So that really stymied that initiative. To actually take it up, we would have had to put an overhead line into the nearest node, which was down at Broken Hill, some 120 kilometres away. So the economics just did not stack up at all. Not to be thwarted, we then embarked upon a series of investigations looking at other sites in New South Wales, and we focused on a property we've got at Hay. Now Hay has got probably about 2,000 hectares. We were looking for whatever the conversion is, 150 acres, 200 acres, so it would have fitted there. Once again, we were thwarted by grid connection problems. In the local substation, they did have capacity. They had capacity of about 135 megawatts. And when I rang up Essential Energy and said, well, we'd like to put a connection agreement in, they said, yeah, fine, no problem. You'll be number 5 in the queue. And what we discovered is the developers had already been there, put connection inquiries in, and effectively had stymied us in developing our own solar farm. So following that, we sat down and thought about this issue. We'd also been looking at the marketplace in New South Wales for solar development and how that was progressing. And the other imperative I had is I had to take out a renewal of the electricity supply agreement, start on the 1st of January this year. So as I was going out to the market anyway, we put a proposal into the executives probably just over a year ago, which said, well, look, we've got to secure a black energy supply at the very minimum. Why don't we run a parallel exercise for a PPA? So after not too much discussion, I have to say, that was a decision that was made. We did have some objectives, though, to achieve. And from Andrew Walter's point of view, obviously, we didn't want to be paying too much of a premium for this. We had looked into buying carbon certificates, green energy, but the premium over black energy was just too much to take. It was about $6 million to buy green energy, which at the time was probably about 50% of our electricity bill. So it was not seen as an economic move, and also it was volatile. The moment you stop buying certificates, then any sustainability claims you might have disappear with it. So the other key drivers we had as well was that we were going to look at solar farms for this PPA. Now you can take PPAs out with wind farms, but because of the university's close association with the development of solar, it was seen as the correct thing to do, to source the electricity from a solar farm rather than a wind farm. And finally, the last 2 points. With regard to the sustainability issue, we really wanted to pass the additionality test, where we were actually bringing in a new supply or causing a new supply to be established, which would displace coal-generated electricity and obviously take those emissions out of the system. And the last point in connection with that is that we were really keen to be able to say, well, look, we can point to the solar farm that we caused to be developed, and we could say that is where our electricity is coming from. This is where we've contracted. So this is not an edifice based on some unknown source of green energy or low emissions energy. We actually could point to the facility that we contracted with. So we thought that was a real benefit to be had. So we then went to tender. The tender was quite an interesting exercise. At the back of our minds obviously was the fallback that if the PPA didn't progress or didn't proceed, we could always take up a regular black supply while we figured out what to do. So we actually ran the two tenders in parallel. So we had a regular black contracting package, which is essentially a list of premises, plus some forecasts on energy use, which the retailers would price. But in addition to that, we also gave a PPA, and we were fortunate the legal team we had working with us, Norton Rose, from their European experience, had a draft PPA that we thought might fit the bill. So we were able to put that into the tender. We looked at about 40 potential developers that were active in Australia, and we culled that down to 30. So there were 30 solar farm developers and half a dozen of the active retailers in New South Wales. So we pushed this out. We said we like the elements priced separately, but what we would really like, and this was a very strong hint that we put into the tender, we would really like a consortium bid between a PPA, solar developer, and the retailer to come back with a combined product. I put that tender out in June, the end of June, and gave the guys a month to respond. With the retailers, that's plenty of time. They can turn prices around pretty quick. But with the developers, we didn't know, but we gave them a month anyway. At the end of that period, we received the tenders back and started our analysis of the results. So what did we find? Well, true to form, the retailers priced the retail section, developers priced the developer section, and nobody gave us a consortium bid, which was quite disappointing, I have to say. The retailer response, we got about, from memory, I think we had 6 responses. When we asked them why, the non-respondents, why they didn't respond, they said, oh, well, we're really busy responding to lots of tenders at the moment. So that was their reason. And half a dozen of the retailers responded. So we got a good response from the retailers. The supply we need is just around about 100 gigawatt hours a year. So it's a good contract for the retailers, and we usually get a good response from them. So we did an analysis, and then we embarked on a process of talking to the respondents, just to gauge who seemed to know what was what, and whether we thought they were a firm we could work with. The responses were very interesting. From the retailers who we thought would be up for PPA, they were quite disappointing. And from the retailers who we thought probably wouldn't, we did get a good response. So whether we'd misread the signs or whether something had happened in the interim that had piqued their interest, I suspect we'll never find out. But we ended up with 2 retailers and 2 developers. We then sat down and we decided, the procurement team decided then which retailer we would pair up with a developer. And we invited them in. So you can imagine we're now sat around a table at the lawyers, and we have myself, the lawyers team, some energy procurement consultants, and across the table from us is a developer and a retailer, and those guys have never met before. So it's one thing that sticks in my mind a lot. It was a bit like one of those old Western films, Clint Eastwood films, where we were sat around the table and we'd all got narrowed eyes and we were all eyeballing each other. So we explained what we would like. We would like a consortium deal between us, the developer, and the retailer to try and sort out a mechanism to make the PPA work. So we then gave them some time out to go and have a discussion amongst themselves. And fortunately for us, two of them came back really keen to do a deal. And the two proponents there were a developer called Mao Neng, who are essentially an Australian developer. They've already developed a smaller solar farm for the ACT offtake agreement down at Mugger Lane. That was 13 megawatts. And the retailer was Origin, which was a bit of a surprise, but in fairness to Origin, they were very keen to come to the table and work with us on this deal. So we then asked for best and final price, as you normally do under a tender situation. And when we got that in, we started some heavy-duty negotiations with them. One of the things I was keen to do in the negotiations was to ensure that we had an environment of cooperation. I didn't want to get into the adversarial type of negotiations because it was key to me that we'd got three people in this marriage, as Diana, Princess of Wales, famously said. But unlike Diana, we wanted this to work. So I wanted to make sure that each of the bodies in this group didn't feel disadvantaged to any of the others, that we had as level a playing field as I could manage under the circumstances. Okay, so that was the tender process we went through, and eventually we decided then to progress with Mao Neng and with Origin. So where did that take us to then? How did we actually stack this deal up? Okay, so this if you like is a proxy for a year's worth of electricity. This is a day's worth of electricity as far as the university is concerned. As it says, the black line represents our use over the day in kilowatt hours, or megawatt hours, and the red line is the output from the solar farm. One of the interesting aspects of this deal is we are taking 100% of our electricity requirement from the solar farm. So other deals that have been done have taken, if I can get that to work, a solar component that fits underneath the daily demand, but for reasons I'll come to shortly, we want to take 100% of our requirement from the solar farm. So you could probably see where this is going. The deal I've got now gives me all the electricity I want, but probably at the wrong time. So during the day, obviously we can take support from the solar farm under our curve, but that does leave us with a rather excess amount of electricity that we've bought. Oh, and I should just mention at this point, this is where the NEM values start to arrive. So if you can imagine, the red line now is what I've bought from the developer. How do I pay for that? Well, the way we structured the deal, the way we pay for that is by a mechanism called a contract for differences, CDF. This is quite a common market instrument, and it revolves around a strike price set against a variable price. So I can explain that mechanism a little bit more. We agreed a fixed strike price with the developer for the electricity that comes out of his solar farm. Now, the developer actually gets paid by the NEM. Developers or generators bid into the NEM, AMO calls off generation to match load, and depending on the value of those bids, sets a price every half hour, in simple terms, for that generation, which they then pay to the generator. AMO doesn't have any money of its own. It gets its money from us, the customers, via the retailer. So if you can imagine, we set a price, let's call that 90, and the NEM is at 100. The developer will actually pay us 10. So that's good. Conversely, if the price is 80, we pay the developer 10. Now, that's then normalised via the retailer. What the retailer does for us is actually charge us NEM values. So on our bill, we actually see the values of the NEM during that daily production. Okay. So let's say on that $90 half hour, I've already paid the developer 10. Sorry, the developer's already paid me 10. So now the retailer is charging me 90. I've got 10 in my hand that I've already got from the developer. So the net then is 80. And conversely, when the value is low, so let's say the NEM is 80, the strike price is 90, I've given the developer 10, but the retailer will only charge me 80. So the 80 I've paid to the retailer plus the 10 I paid back to the generator gives me a strike price of 90. So at the end of the day, I will always pay the strike price. So this is quite an innovation for a retailer to charge us NEM. I don't think I've ever seen that before, but that does make the contract for differences work. So that's how then we solve the payments to the generator. So that still leaves me with the problem now of what do I do with the excess and what do I do for times when the sun's not shining, essentially overnight. Once again, this is where the retailer comes back into the picture. So I've made an agreement with the retailer, he's going to buy that excess from me. But the benefit to us is we keep the LGCs, because my deal with the generator is that I buy megawatt hours and the LGC certificates that go with them. That was part of the strike price. Oh, and I should mention this point. In the way we've analysed this, the value attributed to the LGCs is zero. Market value of LGCs at the moment is about $84 per certificate. But in this scenario, we've attributed a zero value to them. So what we say in regard to that is that this scheme has no subsidy. We take the LGCs and we retire them. We take them out of the system. To answer our detractors about renewable schemes always being subsidised, this one isn't, as we see it. Okay. For the overnight, this was probably one of the easiest parts. We just took out a regular black contract, so we get peak and off-peak prices. And for the power we use overnight, we pay Origin for that on a normal basis off meter reads. What's interesting now, though, is that we could have paid twice now for electricity, but of course we got a buyback for the excess solar, and we use that buyback then to offset the cost of the overnight. So the upshot is, if our calculations and forecasts are right, is that we will be paying virtually the same as we would have paid, probably even a little less than we would have paid under a regular black contract, if all this works as we've planned. And at the moment, we were meeting with Origin yesterday. The models we put together at the time we did the contract, which we signed just at the back end of last year, are still valid. Everybody's still nodding, I'm pleased to say. Nobody is saying, yeah, but what about this and what about that? We still see this scheme working as we planned. So that was quite reassuring, I must say. What is different for us probably is the amount of admin work we have to put into this to actually keep this going in our accounts. There are problems with forecasting, there's problems with latency in the system. For energy use in 1 month, we might not get a bill for 6 weeks. Normally you get a bill in the first week or two following the month of use. That's now extended out. And this is because of the settlement on the NEM. Settlement on the NEM takes several weeks. those final figures go then to the solar farm, and the solar farm then bill us. So that takes time to put through, and then obviously working that in with the buyback and the billing from Origin, that obviously takes a short while as well. In fact, we're stepping outside the normal Origin billing systems, and I think we're going to have a bespoke system written for us, which sort of fills me with a bit of dread, but I'm sure we'll get it to work in due course. The other thing is, normally with the management of electricity contracts or energy contracts from the university side, I have one pot of money with electricity written on it. I get a bill and I pay out of that pot against the bill. What we've got now is an account with the solar farm developer, and then I've got 3 accounts with Origin. I've got one for buyback, one for them charging, and one for overnight. Now on 2 of those accounts, they are going to be either credited or debited. So now I've got cash flow in the system, which is something we didn't have before. So now we're in discussions with our colleagues in finance as to how best to bill this. Finance would like separate billing for each aspect of this, so they've got watertight audit trails. We've got a preference for net billing from Origin, because that makes our job easier. Verifying the bills is going to be an interesting exercise, as we've now got to get hold of NEM half-hour data, and in a couple of years that'll probably revert to 5-minute data as they change the NEM rules. So I think we're going to have some pretty big spreadsheets to wield in the future, but I know Jose is up to the task for that. So somewhere in here I've got I did have a lessons learned. Yeah, there were a couple of things in there that really helped with this process. And I think if I had to pick one, I'd say getting the execs on board early. I've said brief the execs. I should have said and brief them many times. We spend a lot of time talking the execs through this. I mean, it's not an area they normally live in. Talking about the NEM, contracts for differences, retail agreements, transmission costs, nodes, and so on. It's a bit of a foreign language to them. So they really need to be up to speed before we came back with any sort of proposal from them. And the project objectives. Once again, in our negotiations with the developer and the retailer, having some firm objectives, and credit to Ian Jacobs here, he didn't waver once through this. He had his clear objective that he would like to get as close as we can to energy carbon neutrality, and he was steadfast on that. And because Ian was steadfast, fortunately the rest of the exec team came on board. For this particular case, we had Andrew Walters was our executive sponsor, and to get the man in charge of finance as an executive sponsor, I think it's a pretty neat thing to do. It didn't make our job any easier. We still were given quite a grilling on each step of this process as we were bringing it forward, but what it did do is it opened doors for us. So all the other stakeholders we had to talk to, and there are a lot of stakeholders, academics, treasury, finance, legal, spent a lot of time with legal. They were, how could I put this, they were receptive in our requirements for reviewing documents and for meetings and so on. Cost of acquisition, well, the deal itself over the period is probably worth somewhere in the region of $150 million. We have a 15-year agreement with the solar farm, and we've got a 3-year agreement at the moment with Origin. Because they're providing us with black electricity, we like to make sure we can market test that on a regular basis. Given the size of the deal, obviously this had to go right up to the University Council for final approval. And hats off to Jose, Levin and Amir for the support they gave me, and to my boss Jeff Pears, who had to spend a lot of time in front of the University Council rebriefing and going over. What else was interesting from that? Oh, the lawyers. Our lawyers, Norton Rose, I think I mentioned, they're a global firm, so they had some experience in Europe of setting up PPAs. And because this is essentially a contractual construct to achieve this PPA, the lawyer's role in this, I can't understate how important that was. Not only for their contract knowledge, but actually finding lawyers who understood the Australian electricity market in all its complexity. They're a rare breed. There's probably 3 or 4 now who could take this on. Norton Rose, Baker McKenzie, another leader in this. So they were a must-have. We had Energy Action, were our procurement specialists, and we've dealt with Energy Action over the years to do analysis on our electricity procurement. It was good to get a third or an outsider view on this. We had to do a lot of projections where we thought costs were going, where we thought the NEM was going to go, the price is going to go up, and they're going to go down, and we're going to have a stranded contract. So it's good to get a view from an external party. I mean, we spent a lot of time looking at where the NEM may go, because essentially the NEM drives retail prices. And at the end of the day, we wanted to see how we were going to peg to retail prices. So that was an interesting exercise. And what happened? Yeah, we looked at some reports from Bloomberg. Bloomberg New Energy Futures are a good source of information if you want to find out what they're thinking. And also we saw a report from Jacobs that they did following the Finkel review as to where they thought NEM prices were likely to go. We discounted the Frontier report that the government had done, as we didn't think that was a very good analysis of the situation at all. Obviously the government liked it because it supported their case, but we weren't too keen on how that looked. And finally, we did spend a lot of time looking at risk. So I had a list of probably 30, 40 what-ifs. So what if the developer goes bust after we sign? What if the construction contract fails? What if the NEM prices crash? What if the NEM prices rocket? What happens if Origin goes out of business? What happens if black prices all take off? So we put together a whole series of these what-ifs, so that as we were quizzed by the executives, because the execs were really interested in what contractual protections we'd got built in. They were on board with the fact of the PPA and the solar, the source of the solar, but what they then focused on was how we were protected in the contract documents. I think the PPA runs to about 150 pages, and we've got the usual convoluted agreements with the retailers. But there were some interesting things that went into the PPA. So we've got the usual force majeure clauses, but we've also got make good clauses. So if the solar farm delivery fails or is less than we'd anticipated, then they have make good provisions in there, which was quite reassuring. Where we're at the moment is that the developer is out looking for debt and equity partners to join the scheme, with a view to financial close at the end of May. The solar farm itself, it's out of a place called Balranald, which is nearer Adelaide than it is to Sydney, so it's way out west. It's in a great spot, and it is a 200 megawatt installation. We're taking just over 50 megawatts of that capacity, and that was an interesting point. As a user, we want to buy megawatt hours, and as a generator, they want to sell megawatt. So we had that little bridge to cross between us. Essentially, the tack we took is, look, we don't know how much you're going to be generating, so we'll tell what we want. You can decide how much you allocate to us. The other thing that's happened following our offtake agreement is that 100 megawatts of that farm has now been pre-let or let to AGL. And they've also taken out a 15-year agreement, and it's part of their little response. As you know, they want to close the coal-fired station, replace with renewables, and taking half of this solar farm is part of that response to the government. So now there's a solar farm there that the developer has already designed. He's got land options, he's got engineering, he's signed the connection contract, and he's pre-let 3/4 of it. So we're not at this point in time anticipating there's going to be a problem getting finance for it. While I touch on finance, we have found out recently, when we were looking at the cost of solar, we've got a lot of questions about the cost of solar power. Is that going to carry on plummeting? And one of the biggest costs that the developers have to meet is the cost of finance in their deal, interestingly enough. And other big costs are the construction contract, which are not getting any cheaper, and also the heavy engineering for the connection agreement, which once again is not getting any cheaper. And if we just think about the cost of finance, as you probably all know, it's really cheap at the moment. We don't think it's going to get any cheaper, and in all likelihood cost of finance is going to go up. So that will tend to put pressure on their prices as well. So we don't at the moment see a collapse in renewable prices, either for solar or for wind farms. There will be some tweaking, it will drop a bit, but if inflation takes off and the cost of borrowing takes off, then that will either support prices or it will actually drive them up. So that's our view at the moment. And just to finish, if you have any New South Wales geography, that's where it is. Mildura is the nearest town, I've been told. I was talking to the developer earlier this week about a site visit to go and turn the first sod with the golden shovel and do the opening ceremony. And he was saying, well, the best thing to do is actually fly to Melbourne, because flights from Sydney are few and far between. So you fly to Melbourne, fly to Mildura, hire a car, you drive down to the site. We got a few other things wound into the PPA as like added benefits. So we're going to get a visitor centre. You guys can pay a visit. We've got visitor rights. We're going to get direct feed from the meters there rather than have to just get NEM data. They're going to put a camera up. They're going to put some new technology in, new solar technology for us in one of the strings, which is nice. And we also got them to cover some sponsorships for students who want to come to UNSW. So there's some cash in there. So they were nice little extras as well that the developer would fund for us. So we're all excited now. Assuming financial close happens in May, the construction contract will kick off. A company called Deckmill are just about signed up to do it. And the construction program will run through to second quarter next year. And hopefully by the middle of next year, they'll start producing, and we'll be on our way to offsetting our energy-related emissions from certificates generated from our solar farm. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. Questions?
Yes, one at the back.
Nick, congratulations, well done, and Jose too. That's immensely, really hard thing to have done, and having worked just with this university in big projects before, I know that this place can be difficult enough, let alone Origin and all the others as well. So great job.
Thank you.
So it seems to me, just all those what ifs, and there's lots of people out there to poo-poo what we're doing, if they can. So it seems to me the only way we're left a little bit vulnerable is we're still dependent for that black energy in the evenings, in the night time. And if it was to go away, then actually we're not able to operate. So we actually we could be said to be still reliant on coal-fired generation at night.
Yeah, so, it's an interesting point. Obviously, with the perfect way to do it is have a behind-the-meter solution, where you have a big field next to your facility and you just connect up. Obviously we can't do that, but the fact that we get LGCs to cover not only the daytime use, but we have enough LGCs to offset overnight as well, is the way we have to rationalise it. At the end of the day, the generation from the solar farm is pumped into the grid, so we can't track the electrons through anyway. But what we can do is get their sustainability credentials, if you like. We own those because essentially we're putting power into the grid that will displace coal generation. So we hold that credential that says, yeah, that's because we've done that, and we use those credentials then to offset whatever arrives at the university here. So we think that offsetting mechanism from our own generation is a bona fide way to claim the sustainability rights. But yes, we thought about that a lot. In fact, what I've done is I've actually increased the amount of electricity we buy from the solar farm over and above our actual requirement. So we can use those excess LGCs to offset the gas use, because we still use gas on the campus in the boilers and the like. And until we can get round to electrifying the campus altogether, we have to think about how we can deal with the gas as well. So that's how we're doing it in the short to medium term.
More question?
Yeah, just on the CFD, you effectively take spot exposure for the CFD to work. Is that just collared in a time period, is it? So do you effectively take spot on university consumption?
It's whenever the solar is generating.
Whenever the solar's generated.
So whenever they're outputting, that's when our CFD to the spot takes place.
And is that CFD to the volume of the solar, or is it to our consumption at that time?
It's to the volume of the solar.
Gotcha.
Yeah, because actually I have to buy all that volume from the solar farm. Yep.
Gotcha.
So that whole stack.
So we take spot only on production from the PV, which has the CFL, the PPA sitting on it.
Correct.
So we don't actually have any spot price exposure at all then?
No, it's hedged.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hedged all the way through.
Origin hedges that, and you effectively have time of use tariffs with Origin for the...
We call that the firming contract, I think is the current expression for that. We took out 2 contracts with Origin because obviously there's the period between 1st of January this year and when the solar farm comes online. So we're calling that the bridging contract. And as soon as the solar farm switched on, then that flips over to the firming contract. And once again, Origin were very flexible there because we don't know the exact date. Normally, electricity contracts run from here to here, and if that date changes, there's a penalty. With Origin, they were quite flexible on that end date. So once again, they were willing to come to the party and work with us. Obviously, they see a commercial opportunity here, as do the lawyers, and probably as do the developers who've got ambitions to get 500 megawatts, I think they're looking to actually build in New South Wales. So obviously it's their interest as well to figure out a method to get this to work.
I do hear there are some consortia or single companies which will now do both. So, for example, Engie has a renewables development arm, but it also has the retail side of the business as well. So I think that the package solution is coming. Wasn't there for you, but it's now coming.
And we were talking, I say, with Origin yesterday, and they're already thinking of doing a sleeved deal.
So that's what Engie's doing.
Yeah, so they will offer a PPA with a developer for solar or wind, and they'll sleeve that deal. So the customer would have to take a long-term deal with the generator, and then short-term deal with, well, probably a long-term deal if they can swing it with Origin. So yeah, already there's starting to be nuances on this and some tweaks. I quite like it because we're pegged to the NEM for 60-70% of our offtake, and that means we get a pretty good price because you take out several levels of margin by dealing direct with the generator. All the other costs, transmission, distribution, market costs, metering and so on, they're passed through, which is the same we'd pay on any black contract as well.
It's a great way to take NEM spot exposure, but fully hedged.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Really nice.
Well, I understand the retailers do that all the time. I think that's how they, and then they do the caps as well. So they've got all sorts of stuff going on. But yes, it's my first entry into that market, and it was a fascinating process. You know, I learnt a lot as we went on.
I'm sure the Ballister wants
Yes.
energy efficiency.
Okay, I'm ready, Alistair.
No, it's all good.
Nick, thanks so much. And just to say again what Richard was saying, well done. Just curious to hear your thoughts on how this impacts your efforts now and your team's efforts to say implement more energy efficiency around the university or more behind the meter solar systems or whatever it is you want to do. Does that change the landscape for you? I mean, I think it's probably going to be still the same old economic argument, but will you get pushback now and say, well, Nick, don't worry?
I've already heard that one. And I reply with, well, you can't get cheaper than off. So that's always a good starting point. And behind the meter solar is always going to be cheaper than grid solar. So my imperative now is sort of moved from emissions reduction. I mean, it's still there, but the main imperative now is financial. So if we run energy efficiency projects, it's really about pulling back on the finances. And obviously, from an engineering point of view, it's nice to have things running efficiently and not seeing them on all night or as we do and used excessively. So yeah, there's still a job to do, I'm pleased to say. Yeah.
If I may, a follow up on that. I think in the past, or I think still, the major focus for reducing the bills to the university is reducing the peaks, the monthly peaks, not the actual sort of lower level uses. Not just orientation week, and the first week in the early weeks have usually been the biggest spikes, and that sort of set the tone. Is that still true?
Oh yes, yeah. We
Sorry, will it still be true?
Absolutely. Our demand charges are currently running at about $7,000 a year per 100 kVA. And as you know, on this site, 100 kVA, you could see that any time. So we've been doing some work with the standby generators that we have. We have a lot of standby generators. So gradually, we've been converting the older ones to run in parallel with the mains. And in our new buildings, we get that facility put in straight away. What that means is we can put the generators on for a very short period just to manage that daily peak. We went through a process of doing that hydraulically. So I'd ring up engineering and somebody would run off and switch it on. We then integrated the controls into the BMS so I could switch them on from my desk. And of recent times, we've now married the two, so we've put thresholds into the BMS. So if demand gets to a certain level, it pulls on generators. So yeah, so we're still looking at that.
So with the new solar deal, it's the same story?
Exactly the same, yes. All those transmission, distribution, market, metering, and so on, all those costs still remain. Yeah, we don't lose any of those. The only one we lose on the bill is the large-scale generation bill, part of the environmental charges, because I'm now responsible for surrendering those certificates to Origin, rather than them putting some price with a markup on my bill. So we'll save a little bit there as well. But yes, we focus a lot on demand.
Just a question, extension on that. Is there a peak demand charge in our firming contract of Origin, or is it only in the network tariffs?
With the Origin bill, I get traditional peak shoulder and off-peak rates.
With no peak demand charge, it's a network bill.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's all passed through then. Those are the charges, which, I mean, we've done that for years. That's the traditional way of doing our type of contract on electricity.
You said you were motivated to go solar rather than wind because of the work done at this university. Were you able to stipulate that the modules they use on the solar farm are somehow tied in with UNSW technology, like PERC cells, for example?
Yes, they're using fairly traditional cells for the main site. I think they've got 320 watt panels on a single axis tilt. But as part of the deal, we've got them to put PERC in on one of the strings. So that's probably, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 megawatts of PERC in there. So they said, yeah, okay, they'll do that.
Why didn't they use PERC for the whole farm? Were they?
Well, they're more expensive than established. I can't dictate really to those guys what they do on their solar farm. I assume they've got deals going with whoever already on the solar panels. I mean, they're in deep discussions because I understand there's a potential shortage of supply at the moment. So they've been having discussions with panel manufacturers for a long while. Yeah. Would have been great to have PERC.
Did you say the overall cost ends up about the same as fossil fuel-based electricity?
Yeah. Or possibly even a little bit cheaper.
And would wind have been cheaper, or solar's now beating even wind?
At the time we went out to tender, there wasn't much in it. The other thing we came across actually was that it's very difficult to do a deal if the solar farm is in a different state, because of the interstate connectors put a lot of risk into the scheme, not from the generator point of view, but from the retailer point of view. And as you know, risk costs. And particularly if they didn't have generating assets, if you had somebody in Queensland who didn't have generating assets in New South Wales, they'd have been looking to pick up firm electricity at the last minute if the solar farm dipped. And boy, that would have been really expensive, and the risk was too much. So having the facility in New South Wales was the best economic solution there. You know.
Just a quick comment from me. I guess 2 to 3 megawatts of PERC would more than cover our electricity bill in Tyree. So perhaps we'll just identify.
We'll see if we can pick those electrons out for you, Alistair. Yeah. Or you can go down there and pick them out yourself if you like. Okay.
A quick question about the LGCs. There's a lot of talk about them disappearing in the next few years. How would that affect your
Okay. The way I understand it is that instead of an increasing target for the life of the RET out to 2030, the target's going to be frozen in 2020. So the scheme will still exist. You'll still be able to get RET certificates, but the obligation on the retailers, they like to say it's an obligation on the consumers, but it's actually an obligation on the retailers to keep increasing the amount of LGCs or projects they do to equivalent value. Will continue out to the end of the RET. In the contract, to protect ourselves against this, we've got alternative, they have to make good with alternative environmental products should LGCs disappear. Obviously there's some risk in there because we're not quite sure where they'll come from and as to whether we like the look of them. We obviously have a say in that and whether that's acceptable or not. And obviously we're going to have to do something after 2030 because the contract runs on until 2033. But I'm sure by then we will have carbon trading, without a doubt, and certificates from the carbon market will be available for us then.
Let's thank Nick again. It was great.
Thank you.